The motion be agreed to. Claire Curran.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to, I'm pleased to take a call in the third reading, and I'd like to place again on the record my thanks to the officials for the hard work that they've done during the passage of this bill. It has been a very complex bill. It's been, I think my colleague Jacinda Ardern described it as fraught. I've found it to be quite exciting and challenging, and because ultimately I think that it's about the future, and that the underlying issues are about the future and how we use the internet, and it's enabled us, I think, as a parliament to start really thinking about that and addressing some of those issues. I'd also like to place on record my thanks to the Select Committee, to the Chair, Leanne Dalzell, and to the other members of the committee, all of them. I'd also like to say that it was an interesting and generally quite constructive experience to engage with the Minister on this issue, Minister Simon Power, and certainly with the industry, and to all of those people out there listening, as I know there are many hundreds, perhaps thousands of people at the moment watching this parliamentary debate, because I know how deeply that they feel about this issue. I want to say to you that Labor supports this bill, and it supports it on the basis that there has been a negotiated solution, that while their termination, suspension of internet accounts remains in this bill, it is not enacted. And that's the only basis on which we could support it. And Labor fundamentally believes that New Zealanders have a right to access the internet, and all New Zealanders should be able to access the internet. And we are fundamentally opposed to internet disconnection. And I can't say that any more plainly than that. This compromise means that the suspension of internet access as an ultimate penalty for repeat copyright infringement remains in the bill, and it cannot be enacted unless the Minister makes the decision to do so. And the Minister making the decision to do so would have to do so on the basis of there being a case put clearly by the rights holders, and in order to prove the damage being done to the industry. And it's our opinion that that case cannot be made in this current environment. Labor's, as you know, our preferred option was to completely omit account suspension, but National's position was intractable. And I'd like to again also put on record, particularly for the Green members in this House, that Labor has been transparent and open about all of those matters right from the very beginning. Having addressed that, I would like to say a few things about the debate that's been had tonight, because the debate has gone in a number of interesting directions. There's been a number of matters that weren't discussed, unfortunately, and one of them being the costs of, although actually I must correct myself and say that one of the members opposite did raise that issue. I would have liked to have got into that issue a little bit more in terms of the, and which goes to the regulations that this bill and how this bill will actually act in practice, and who and what those costs will entail, and who they will and who will end up paying them in order to make this regime work. There were a number of extremely interesting submissions around this matter, and a number of estimations made on the actual cost of producing a notice that would go to a person using the internet who was alleged to have infringed. And that cost, I think, was estimated by one of the internet service providers as somewhere between $1 and $28 per notice to actually process and send. So the costs, I think this is something that is going to need to be continued to be examined in terms of how many notices actually get put out there and what the costs are and who ends up paying for it. There are a number of other issues to be addressed as well. I think, though, and this I think is a positive thing in some ways, but one of the things that this debate has done is that it's now firmly put on the agenda the thorny and frightening issue of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is it has been described as a trade agreement, but it's fast becoming something that is much more than that, and goes to the heart of sovereignty, issues around sovereignty. And a number of the speakers in the House tonight have talked about that, and I, just to quickly recap, mentioned the fact that while this bill was passing through the House, there is the spectre of its ability for New Zealand to put in place its own copyright regime to be overtaken by something much, much bigger and much more frightening in terms of our intellectual property rights and our ability to manage our own creative content. And that essentially it could be overtaken by this bill. Labor has made statements around this and asked for more transparency and for a broadened dialogue and for the government to make a commitment to that. And so far tonight, despite repeated calls, there's been no sense of that coming from the other side of the House, and that is a great disappointment. So, Mr. Speaker, to go back to the core parts of this bill will establish a regime that deters file sharing that infringes copyright. It is hoped by many in this House, and indeed I think by all of us across this House, that the intent of this bill will largely be served by the educational role of the notice and notice regime, and that the point at which an alleged infringer is taken to a tribunal will be very minimal, and that essentially if people are infringing copyright and not knowing, which is what much of the research shows, that they aren't aware that what they're doing is actually illegal, then they will cease that behaviour once they've received a notice, or the first notice or the second notice. And that is essentially what we are hoping will happen. But as in every regime around the world that is dealing with these issues at the moment, there is still no real conclusive evidence on that. And we are lucky in the sense in New Zealand that we are tonight putting through this House legislation that does not include that draconian measure of suspension and termination, which has turned so many other environments in the international area on their head and created a flashpoint for protest. And as I mentioned in my second reading speech, in the UK there is a High Court case, a judicial review happening as we speak on their legislation because it includes termination. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I want to say that Labor supports this bill. We support it with reservations. We believe there are some much bigger issues to deal with on this issue, and we look forward to providing substantive policy in this area. Very good.